Why do you think some people, they say they want to change, but they don't want to change? Why is that?
It's it's the discomfort of the unknown, right? And as crazy as it sounds, and most people they even if they know, for example, they're in a relationship that is not fulfilling or unhealthy, they won't make a change because they're scared of what the uncertainty is, what's on the other side. Yeah, well, I think you read my mind because I was going to touch on this. And a lot of times, just to give some context, when I'm working with clients and they're really struggling to find meaning or purpose in their life, and they feel like they've got so many things going on, so many conflicting priorities, one of the simplest exercises, and it's something the Stoics would do, and a lot of spiritual practices do too, is
What if you turn hardship into greatness, anger into serenity? Everything changes. Make your life a masterpiece. Welcome, I'm Yannick, your host, and now joining me, Furkhan Dandia. Furkhan Dandia is a therapist who has a master's degree in counseling psychology. He also has a MBA and a engineering degree. Have you ever wondered what anger is? What anger does to you, to your mental health and your life? And how to actually free yourself from anger and also to become your best self. This and so much more now. Welcome, Furkhan Dandia, to the show. It's such a blessing to have you.
yeah, Yannick, thank you again. I am always a pleasure to speak with you. I know we've tried once before, and I really enjoyed our conversation. So I'm glad to be here and super honored that you've invited me to come on your show.
I really want to thank you because we had a technical issue and I tried to resolve it, and unfortunately I didn't somehow work, and therefore we do it again. So I'm extremely appreciative of taking the time again. So really nice. So just to start, who is Furkan Dandia in simply one powerful sentence?
One powerful sentence. That's a lot of pressure. I would say I'm just a man, a father, and a human who's figuring it out every day in this life and trying to do my best every day and serve the world to the best of my capabilities.
Beautiful. And also, thank you so much for taking up the responsibility because we need more parents, people who take up the responsibility. I'm always so grateful. And I don't have kids, but that's, always it depends, right? Sometimes it's not the case, but I'm always extremely grateful for people who take on the most important job in this world, being a mother and a father. So wonderful to know. Now let's start defining what we mean by anger.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, anger is useful, and I'm glad that you touched on it because we all tend to experience anger, and people have this misperception that anger is often this loud reaction that can be aggressive, full of rage. But a lot of people will often keep it silent and also direct that anger inward. Neither approach or response, as we say, to anger is appropriate. It needs to be expressed in a healthy way. There's many consequences when we're not able to express anger in a healthy way, or if we experience it many times. There's been a lot of research that's coming out more recently as well, if not in the last couple of decades too. But if emotions in general, which anger is, aren't expressed appropriately, then we will tend to experience a lot of health issues. So many chronic health issues that we're seeing today, whether it's chronic pain, some other illnesses, even something like cancer that we talk about a lot, is because a lot of people struggle with expressing their emotions. And I want to emphasize the aspect of emotion here because anger is like all our other emotions. So it's there for a reason, it serves a purpose. And if we truly pay attention to it, it can give us a lot of information. For example, if our boundaries are being violated, if someone is disrespecting us, if we're uncomfortable in a situation where we might be experiencing anger, that's all information we can use to either express or assert our boundaries or constructively respond to the anger by removing ourselves from the situation or even doing some self-care techniques to regulate our emotional system and regulate in the sense of communicating as well. So those are all the ways we can use that information that we gain from anger. So I know it's there's a lot there, and I'm happy to go dive deeper. But I just wanted to kind of give that overview of anger.
Yeah, and also to some extent, negative emotions also give us the opportunity to actually address something in us, and it gives us the opportunity to actually have a sense of morality, because if everything will be good within us, there is no need for a morality, right? You can only be moral if you also have the capacity to have negative anger or the potential of doing harm, but yet you don't, right? And so that really comes handy. I
Mhm.
just want to go back a little bit in terms of your biography. What made you interested in diving into anger and ultimately pursue a degree in counseling
Mhm.
psychology? So just walk us through your path and how you discovered your true calling.
Yes, absolutely. I do want to touch on one thing before we go in that direction because you talked about negative emotion, and I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions we have around anger because we tend to label it as such. And it's not negative or positive. It's just like any other emotion, right? So I just want to emphasize that. And that's where people really struggle and experience so much shame with anger is because we look at it as this bad thing. But if we just looked at it as something that we all experience and it served our species, that's why we've evolved. So just wanted to put that there. But as far as my biography goes, you touched on it when you were introducing me. My background was in engineering. I worked in the corporate side of things for almost 2 decades. And as I was going through a divorce, which has been like 7 years now, I started to realize my own mental health issues that were coming up, whether it was around shame, whether it was feeling alone or isolated at times. And one of the things was anger. I had anger um, even from the process of divorce and something I had struggled with from childhood I, because of the shame, I personalized how people treated me. And that often resulted in anger. And by understanding myself, going through the process of therapy myself, I realized that, and this may sound obvious, but what people were doing around me was not a reflection of me. But we all tend to take things personally when we have some insecurities or when we're trying to figure things out. So that was a huge issue for me where I would experience anger because I didn't know how to express myself in a healthy way, or I didn't know how to assert boundaries. And sometimes when you're in family situations, there's a lot of enmeshment, so it can be even more difficult to express boundaries. So by going through that depth of understanding and my own personal experience with divorce, I also realized how much men in general struggle, whether it's with anger or shame, especially as they're navigating different situations in life, could be work related, career related, could be relationship related. So I felt that I'm not the only one who's going through this. And how can I be an advocate for other men when it comes to mental health? And that's what really propelled me into going in the space of therapy. I started my master's during the pandemic, and I've been working. Fortunately, I was able to connect to an amazing individual who runs anger management groups, um, and has been doing so for 30 years. And he saw something in me and asked me to join his team. So that's really helped me, because it's also helped me understand anger in a different light, but also help other men as they're navigating it. So that's kind of just, yeah, like you said, the calling, but I had to step into it, right? And sometimes we all get this calling to do something with our lives and take on that responsibility, and we don't listen to it. And when I started listening to it, these opportunities, like working with this individual I just mentioned, started to fall into my lap. And it's things that I had never even envisioned would happen when I decided to go in that therapy direction.
How was it when you started going to these anger management sessions?
Hmm. Like attending as a facilitator. um
Yeah, or a client. I guess you went there as you were also seeking somehow some support how you deal with your own anger.
yeah, yeah, I think I didn't really attend myself, but as a facilitator, what I've come to learn is ultimately it's all shame driven. Even for me, it was shame driven. Even the men I talk to or I support, it's shame driven. And we tell a story in our to ourselves. So we've created this narrative about who we are, right? And a lot of times the common language around shame is I'm not good enough, I'm a failure, I don't deserve good things, or I'm not worthy. You can kind of structure it along those lines. And anytime we feel, because we've created this story in our head, that's how we're acting, and people are responding that way, right? It's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, and you then project your feelings or how you feel about yourself onto other people, and that's just reinforcement. And then we experience anger because the other person is mirroring back to us exactly what we're thinking. And that could sound really complex, but it's not. You're basically, people are reacting to the version we're putting out into the world, right? So if we're showing up as this person who feels like a failure, that's how we're carrying ourselves. That's the language we're choosing and how we describe ourselves. So when other people reinforce that, instead of looking inward, we get angry at them, right? And so ultimately, when you're able to identify that stress and the shame that comes from it, then we can work on it, right? So often I will even ask people, are you angry at the other person or are you angry at yourself? And that takes a moment for them to think about. And I notice there's so much awareness that comes up. And then when you can recognize that you're actually angry at yourself, that just gives you more accountability that, okay, this is something I'm doing. It's not about anyone else around me. And then the goal is to work past that shame, because that shame message that we have started somewhere early in life or along the way as we were growing up. And then it's trying to unravel it, right? That alone can be a significant process.
That's really interesting. Do you think that shame is actually part of the fabric of who we are meant to become?
I think so. I think it's kind of the Jungian psychology aspect there, that the shame can drive us. That's the shadow self, right? If I have this message about me, I know I internalized a lot of the messaging I received early around that I'm not good enough from the caregivers or adults around me, or even the kids that I was growing up with. I used that as motivation to prove them wrong. But as the Jungian work explains, you could take that shadow side too far. So for me, in the healthy sense, when I'm able to integrate that shadow, I can use that as a motivating factor. But then on the unhealthy side, it became so much that I was trying to achieve, just to prove to people or get a pat on the back so I could feel good enough. And that was just fleeting. Nothing was good enough, no matter what achievement I had. And I was just driving myself. So that's where you have to be very careful. You can integrate that into your psyche and use it as a motivating force, but also recognize where it drives you into the chaos or some of the unhealthy behaviors. And like I said, for me, it was just everything I was doing was to get approval and seek that validation. And it was never enough.
Yeah, because you always set the goalposts further away, right? Once you achieved one thing, you just put it further, right? Why do you think is that? Why do you or do we set our goalpost constantly further and further away once we achieved one goal?
Well, I think there's two aspects to it, right? I think there's we need that as humans, right? Because the physiological response that we get by pursuing a goal, like the natural dopamine release we experience, not the quick dopamine hits we have nowadays, like whether it's substances or sex or whatever. No, I mean the real healthy dopamine release we get is in the pursuit of a goal. So it's good to have a goal. And if you achieve it, then yes, you may want to push out that goalpost so you have something to constantly work towards. Otherwise, you wouldn't be motivated. You wouldn't be able to get out of bed. But you have to be conscious of it, right? If you're doing it in the unhealthy sense, like what I'm referring to in my personal example, I was driven. Yeah, like I felt great chasing goals, but then I would feel almost this sort of depression when I achieved a goal. And the first time I remember that was when I finished my MBA, finished my last class. I'm walking on campus and I just felt this, like, it was almost like this cloak of depression came over me because I didn't have a goal anymore. And it was just achievement driven, right? So I think you have to be aware of consciously setting goals and being mindful of, okay, why am I doing this? Is what's the purpose of doing this? Is this going to get me closer to my purpose? Is it serving me? And if you're just mindlessly pursuing goals for the sake of achievement so you can get some sort of validation, that's where it's a problem. But as long as you're honest with yourself, that's what I've learned. I do still set goalposts. You know, I achieve something. It's like, okay, now I'm pushing that goalpost out further, but I try to be way more aware and conscious of why I'm doing it. So that's what I've observed in myself, and I think a lot of people benefit from that.
Yeah, and I think it's also what really drives us. It's also obviously evolutionary processes, right? That's built in us. And
Yes.
that's why one of the biggest challenges that we face is mental health, especially in our youth. And by and large, this is due to the fact that we don't have the exercise that we need in order to keep our biochemistry, you know, in a healthy balance. And that's what really comes down as well. You are referring to young, right? The unconscious and the conscious has to be somehow integrated in a whole. If we just focus on the conscience and we neglect the unconscious, we have an imbalance. And so my question is, do you think that most of the challenges we face, and of course there are different stages of life we go through, do you think it has to do mainly about the culture we live in, or is it the fact that people have more and more become too much focused on the material and neglect the spiritual, in other words, the unconscious? What is it? What do you think is it that causes so much challenges in our world? Because I just give you an example. I never struggled with mental health. Why? Because I was always every single day I was working out
Mm-hmm.
1 to 2 to 3 times when I was especially young until my mid 20s.
Mm-hmm.
And then all of a sudden I had
Mm-hmm.
an accident with my back. It put me down for almost a month. I had to go to therapy. I couldn't walk anymore. I couldn't exercise anymore. After that, I just somehow I felt like, you know what, there's like a cloud in my head, and it was weird. I just kind of felt like just push through whatever. But no, ultimately, I got diagnosed, with depression, and I took some medication, and it took me about 7 weeks or so to get better. And I just felt like, hey, I'm still very vulnerable in terms of my, because there's always a scar, right, that remains. And up to today, I'm very conscious in terms of my consummation of media or being on the screen, right? So tell us, what do you think is the reason according to
Yeah.
you?
Yeah. No, I think you've touched on a lot of things. And I do want to tie in a thread here to expand and answer your question, but you touched on something really important from an evolutionary perspective too, right? And you look at our ancestors, right? We wouldn't have discovered different parts of the world if we didn't have those goalposts pushing out, right? You discovered a land, and it's like, well, me and my tribe, we're gonna move and see if there's anything else out there. There was that constant pursuit of more. And again, there's a healthy and unhealthy way of looking at it. But that's what allowed us to expand across the world as a species. But tying it into the culture today in the same vein, we've become so sedentary, right? So your question was, is it cultural or is it materialistic? And I think it's both, because the culture is so embedded in the material, right? And we tend to pursue goals that are based on materialistic things. And I'm not saying this as a form of judgment, but I was also there. I was chasing, okay, well, I need this house, I need this job title, I need this car, right? And if I had all these things, I think I've achieved what I was supposed to achieve. And I did. And I'm grateful, because I learned that those things weren't fulfilling. I I I was actually reflecting on this recently too, that I am super grateful that I was able to achieve those things at a young age, so I could realize how empty it felt and then really find a purpose in life. And that's what's missing in the world today, because everyone's chasing materialistic things and it's never enough. And to me, I do think it's spiritual, because from a spiritual lens, and what I've been able to interpret and how my belief system is oriented, that I can never be a perfect human being. And I'm striving for that every day. There's always something. I make a mistake, I miss the mark, which is truly what the word sin means. And I have to constantly work at bettering myself. That's a never ending pursuit until the day I die. Even if one day I feel like, oh, you know what, today I managed to do really well, I still have the next day to focus on, right? And that to me is a real purpose and real goal setting, is to work on yourself from that spiritual lens. And the unconscious does come in, right? There are things that will get my attention, and I may engage in certain coping behaviors that I will look back and I'm like, that wasn't me behaving in the best way I know I can. But it's important me for to pay attention to that unconscious. Where are these tendencies coming from? Why is my ego still getting in the way at times? Why do I have certain temptations in life? It's being very curious. And I think that's what's missing. And that's why there's so many mental health problems in the world today, because our focus is on the wrong things at times, the materialistic things, right? And we fall into this comparison mindset. So the other thing you touched on was being tied to digital devices, or media for that matter, social media especially. You've got access to millions, if not billions of people online. And any given day, you can look at someone and be like, oh, their life is so much better. And look how happy they are. And look what they have. But that's not a real pursuit of freedom. What you need to focus is on is, how can I be the best version of myself today? Because I know what I need to do. I can only influence my life based on that. So that's kind of my answer to your question, and I hope it kind of addresses what you were looking for.
I think this is also very important for also the listener to really understand, like there are important nuances in the sense that it's not wrong to set goals, to have a mission, to have a vision, big dreams, house, and so on and so forth. I mean, ideally, those things come in the pursuit of your true meaning and purpose. But
Yes.
usually, what happens at the very onset, we don't really know yet, right? And so that is just the things that, when we are young, obviously we want to become to some extent independent, right? So we want to be able to manage our own household, have our own car. These are all natural things, I think. But what's important is that we ultimately recognize it's a journey, that we realize that, okay, that's not the end. What really is the most important part is really the process in you developing into a more giving and healthy
Hmm.
human
Hmm.
being. What do you think is the most important action that someone can take in order to start looking into his or her unconscious,
Yeah.
to start listening to it? What is something an easy tweak that someone can potentially apply without going to therapy? We
Yeah.
go into this a little bit later.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think you read my mind because I was going to touch on this. And a lot of times, just to give some context, when I'm working with clients and they're really struggling to find meaning or purpose in their life, and they feel like they've got so many things going on, so many conflicting priorities, one of the simplest exercises, and it's something the Stoics would do, and a lot of spiritual practices do too, is meditate on your mortality. And in fact, go even deeper than, and I know this can seem dark at times for people because the concept of death can be so scary for people, but you can, it's the one real truth we know, that we're going to die, right? Everything else is very subjective. You can argue that we all have our own biases and perceptions and subjective truths, but that is one thing we cannot deny, right? And then you can argue, well, what happens afterwards? That's not the point. The point is we all know we die someday. So, how can you face that reality and ask yourself, okay, well, what are the things I'm going to be thinking about on my deathbed, especially if I'm still able to think properly and rationalize things? You're not going to be thinking about, well, I wish I'd gotten that car instead of the other car that was $10,000 more. It would have been nicer. Or I wish my house was another 1,000 square feet bigger. No, you're not going to be thinking about those things. You're going to be thinking about, did I spend more time with my family? Did I uh, make the world a better place? Did I contribute in that way? Did I leave a good impression on people? Right. So it's those things that you think about on your deathbed. And that could really help you even understand, where is your unconscious coming into your life today? Right. Why are you making some of the decisions you're making today? Is it for pride? Is it for ego? Is it to get validation, which is something I still struggle with? Is it to prove something to someone else? That can give you more insight. So it's a bit of an exercise in the sense, not only that you meditate on your mortality and reflect on what it would feel like on your deathbed, but then really start getting curious on a day-to-day basis, even meditating on, well, why am I doing the things I'm doing? And are they going to get me to where I would want to be when I'm dying?
That is really practical. I love that. And I think it's so profound, really, to reflect about death, because what I really can hear what you're saying is basically life is really the preparation for dying and death in a positive sense, because you start really truly living in the present, right? And you get the best out of it. And to some extent, that's where we really get the notion of time in a sense, because if there is no constraints, if there are no changes, let's say, in how we look, we don't really have a notion of time.
Mhm. Yes. Well, and I think for a lot of people, death can be scary. It can be anxiety provoking. You see a lot of people who are constantly trying to deny death, right? Whether it's trying to stay young or feel young. But even people who are struggling with it, ask yourself why. Why do you have this fear, right? And that could be a good exercise, or maybe it would provoke more anxiety. And if you know that about yourself, maybe don't do that. But then be honest with yourself that you're in denial, right? But it's something you cannot avoid. So why not face it and think about it? Because it can actually help you reorient your life if you're not already thinking about it, right? Because it's so easy to fall into depression or have a nihilistic view on life that, oh, there's no meaning. Sure, you can make that case, but does it allow you to live your life to the fullest? No, because you're just finding no meaning in it. And then there's the other side of it where you can be just living a pleasureful life, being hedonistic. But again, that provides no meaning either because you're just looking for your next fill. You're just living for the now. You're not thinking about the next 30, 40 years out if you're granted that, right? There's no guarantee. It can happen tomorrow. So even just thinking about that, like, I could drop dead tomorrow. Does that change the way I would live today? And for me too, even though I think about it, the answer is yes. There's so many things I could be doing differently. I wouldn't be working as much, or I'd be home right now if that was the case. But I don't know that, right? It can happen.
What do you think happens after death?
Well, I don't know for sure, but I think you reap what you sow in this world. And I think I'm a firm believer you reconnect with all the amazing souls that you get the pleasure of meeting in this world. And that's why I try to hold myself accountable. Being a father really helps to focus on being the best version of myself, because if I want to see my child or the people I really love in this world after I die, then I need to do my part to make sure I'm living a good life and serving others. But yeah, I think ultimately it's what you reap, based on how you live this life. The concept of heaven and hell obviously is overused and misunderstood, and I believe you can create that even in your existence in this world based on your choices, right? Some people you see just are in a joyful and peaceful state. That's their heaven. And then there's some people who are just constantly experiencing anxiety and fear, and that's their hell. And if you act on that anxiety and fear and hate, uh, the animosity sometimes people exhibit towards other, resentment, then that's what you're going to reap. So you have a choice. That's the beauty of it. That's what free will is.
That's beautiful. It's very deep, and thank you for being so overt about this topic because I truly believe that's the most important topic that people should indulge, and really think about because it has consequences not just for themselves but really for the people around them, right? And you touched on something very important. There are some people who always focus on the negative, and sometimes it can be a challenge, a true challenge that people go through. Mental challenge is very clear, of course,
Yes.
but there is also a certain setting that either you grow up in a certain environment. And I come back to the Abrahamic religions, and to me, in this sense, I'm very empirical because I see what the Judeo-Christian tradition, the Islamic tradition, what they have brought to the very fore. They have blessed us with mathematics and all those kind of wonders and science. And I think it was really the onset of secularization, which almost like seems like self-defeating because they actually gave birth that now is also has in and of itself the mechanism of cancel itself again, and that's where really free will comes into the equation, right? And therefore it's so powerful. So tell me a little bit more about what you think, generally speaking, what people might miss if you stop or stopped. I mean, generally speaking, that's why we live in a secular society with all its advantages, of course. I don't want to deny that. And I think it's important. And it's actually also something that came out from religious institutions in Rome, where the church ultimately said we have to separate the church and politics. So
Yes.
that's also very interesting. So just give me a little bit your sense of why you think people have to find, in one way or another, a way of connecting with something bigger than what's just in front of them. And it doesn't have to be necessarily religion per se, even though I think it is still the most the most effective way of actually knowing that you're actually pursuing something that might be reasonable, because today there are a lot of movements
Mhm.
that say, well, you have to just connect with energy or Gaia and all those currents, and it's very dangerous because it presupposes that everything, all the energy there is actually good for you. But
Mhm.
again, we come back to ancient religions and even Hinduism.
Yes.
It's very, very clear that there is good and that there is bad.
Yes.
Whether you want to believe in hell or in heaven, that's a different matter.
Yeah.
But I think we can't deny that there is positive, that there are positive and also negative forces.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just kind of go off. It may seem like a tangent, but I will come back to answering your question for sure. And I think talking about good and evil, it is, right? And we see this all the time. People, the human being in general, is susceptible and can get misguided when, and we've already touched on this in a way, power, fame, you can group the two together, lust. These are all temptations that we are vulnerable to. And that can get us off our path to the truth or the source, right? So I while I do believe in religion, I can also see how religion can mislead people because it can allow them to then pursue power and even lust in their own um, superiority when it comes to their beliefs, right? So there's problems in religion, and you can see the same thing in politics. I don't see any differences in the two because people are generally, when they're misguided, acting not for the greater good of society, but they're acting out of their own selfish personal benefits. So that both can be misguided in that sense. And you see that even in the secular world, in some of the things you touched on, whether it's worshiping Mother Earth or Gaia for that matter, um, people's own ideologies for that matter. A lot of it is, again, like I said, we are flawed by nature. And we're told that in many of the spiritual practices that we are flawed by nature. And because of that, we are vulnerable to falling prey to our own need and desires for power and lust and all of that. So that's the biggest issue I see, right? And whether or not you seek out religion, at the end of the day, it's believing that there is something bigger than us. And I think that for me, I can only speak for myself. I find that connection to this higher power something that's very personal, and I see the benefits of it. I also work in addiction recovery, and I see people who truly connect to that higher power, how much it changes their life. They're no longer seeking connection through their addictive behaviors, whether it's substance oriented or not. They find peace and contentment within their lives. And that's all I could say with respect to my personal experience is finding that connection whether it's through religion, which I've been able to experience as well, or not. But ultimately, you cannot deny that connection. And that's what helps people, even in the mental health side of things, when you're able to accept difficult situations, knowing that there is a bigger purpose behind this, right? And there's something we do not see. And the other thing I would add is, for me, knowing that I cannot control everything around me through my free will, I have certain choices and I can influence certain situations, but all of that still, most of it is out of my hands. And that keeps me humble. It keeps me humble. And I think that's humility is needed, right? And I'm super grateful that I've had many experiences of being humbled, because then I can realize that power and lust are all temporary. They don't get you anywhere, and it always feels empty. And that's been the theme of our conversation, is it's a never ending pursuit. How many people that you see, I mean, history doesn't lie, right? How many people you see, they conquer a part of a land? Are they happy, or do they sit back and say, okay, you know what, this is enough? No, it's never enough. They want, okay, well, now I need to go conquer this piece of land. And you see that in politics too.
Yeah, it's a curse, and that's why I think it's so important to just visualize that you have to believe in something much higher than yourself and your surroundings, because otherwise you just replace it with something else. And that's what happened, in so many ways, and time and again. And there's so many people who think they are somehow over it. But I think history, just as you just mentioned, just shows that the facts, they contradict that we can easily live without any religions, because it's of our fabric of whatever we do. It's the way we connect, the way we somehow connect into the, you mentioned Jung, right? The collective unconscious, right? It's part of a history. It's as much part of a history as we can track it down to genetics, but we can also actually track it down to ideas and a spirit that is somehow alive, whether we want to believe it or not. So, what made you interested in Jungian psychology?
Mm-hmm. Uh, that's, I've never been asked that, but I think it's just his exploration and how he connected. And I think part of it was I wasn't even aware of this, but I naturally gravitated towards his work when I first started reading about psychology. And it was just his understanding of how it all goes back to the soul, right? So he, just for people that aren't aware, he was kind of in the Freudian school early on, but then kind of separated for Freud, because Freud's view was that we're mostly driven by our sexual desires and impulses, which is partly true. We are. But Jung said, no, there's a deeper longing that we're all seeking. And that's where the unconscious comes in. And he explored in depth what our psyche is. And in fact, in some of his books I've read, is a lot of it comes in the second half of our life. So for many people, which is why you kind of look at the prophetic figures, and you touched on the Abrahamic religions, most of them got revelations later in life, right? So there's something to be said about that second half of your life. And you see many people, and again, in today's world, we call it midlife crisis, but it's not, because you realize that there's more to life than what I've been already living. Life is supposed to be meaning. And unfortunately, if we don't look at it from a healthy lens, we'll go pursuing all kinds of crazy things, never really finding that meaningful thing that we're searching for. And that really resonated with me based on Jung's work. And he talks a lot about synchronicity and the psyche, as I've touched on. And it started making sense to me that a lot of these things that happen are happening for us in general. And sometimes we just have to pay attention. And the more I started paying attention to these things, the more they started making sense.
It's very interesting because I contacted you obviously, and I had no clue obviously what kind of approach you had leaned into it, right? And so now you're talking about Jung because I'm reading his work, Modern Man in
Mhm.
Search of a Soul, right?
Yes.
And it's just so deep. Almost every sentence just it lights up truly your soul.
Yes.
It's so deeply, and I realized that when I was reading theology, that all of a sudden when I was reading theology, that my heart and my mind was in sync.
Mhm.
Okay, whereas when I was reading others, it wasn't happening. So it's really powerful how some work really can really correspond to someone and maybe others not. And I
Yeah.
think it's really all about finding and also accepting that there are seasons in life, right? And we have to embrace them. Do you think that while we grow older physically, we somehow grow younger spiritually?
I believe so, if that is the path you choose, right? Because not everyone chooses that path, right? There's someone who came on my podcast a couple years ago, and he said something really profound. He said, "We're all chosen, but only some of us choose." And I think, to kind of plug that in, that's the idea, right? Once we choose, then yes, I agree with you. We go back to that childlike state of wonder before we got all our conditioning. You look at babies. I love seeing babies because their eyes are wide. They're just exploring, and they're not scared, right? And you see parents, even myself, I'd be like, don't do this, you're gonna get hurt, don't do that. And it's like you're already conditioning them. You're putting fear into them. And that's how we live. We live with fear. Fear of death, fear of failure, fear of losing our job, right? But kids don't have that. And that's what happens, to your question, is spiritually, when we choose that path, we start going back to that awe where the simplest thing, right? Like seeing the sunrise in the morning gives us joy because we don't take the time to look at it. The someone just spending time with us, quality time, and showing us love feels amazing and joyful rather than us pursuing all these meaningless goals in life. So that's what the childlike state is. It's just wonder and awe and love, curiosity. And that's how we can shed all these layers and veils we put over our hearts over time. And yeah, I see so many people, and so many people are struggling because they're unable to make that choice that I was talking about.
Why do you think some people are more inclined to make this choice and others aren't?
I mean, that's the question of humanity, right? And I don't know the answer to that. I think in my religious practice, um, if I may, God says he misguides whomever he wants, and no one can guide them, and he guides those he wants. And I mean, there's an aspect of that. But I mean, you see it throughout history since the beginning of time. Some people make that choice and some don't, and that's, I think, there is that dichotomy for a reason, right? Even in the like, I think Christianity talks about, or in the Old Testament, they talk about the Cain and Abel story, right? That's that's two versions of what you get in life. You've got one that's the resentful, bitter brother, and then you've got the one who's making the appropriate sacrifices. One's choosing that life, and the other is unable to get out of his own way. There's a reason these stories have survived the test of time.
Again, and you are so clear about that. It's really about choices, and the choices are really in our hands. In other words, your destiny is really in your hand. It's what you ultimately choose. And I think it was really helpful when you saw that everyone is choosing, but not everyone chooses, right? I think it's such a powerful way of looking at the world, because in every single moment you make decisions and it's empowering.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we have a choice, and the beauty of it is we have the stories in front of us. You don't have to guess. You could see what happens to people that don't choose, and you could see what happens to people that choose. Now, it's not easy, right? When like this is the thing. Once you realize to choose, and sometimes once you see things, you cannot unsee them. And then as you move forward, the sacrifices that are demanded of you to continue to progress get bigger and bigger. Absolutely. I mean, I look at, again, I'm grateful. I look at living in a life, or living a life where I would say my eyes were closed and I was just kind of autopilot, moving from one day to the other. Things seemed easy. But now that I've gone on this path, what I'm being demanded to do every day is getting more difficult and challenging. But that's the test. And I think once you make that choice, you can't go back, because you know what it's like in the other, the choice, the, I guess the option of not choosing.
Yeah, it's young, right? You gotta aim high.
Yeah.
It's really what it is. I think he's so profound. There is no doubt. Whenever I read a book, or you read, news or whatever, I mean, his work is so embedded in our culture. It's such a profound thinker, and how he bridges the past with the present and the future. It's just beautiful. And it's really a recipe for living a simple but not easy life. I think
Yes.
that's also very important.
Yes.
Because if you want to grow your muscles, you got to go to gym. There's no way around it. And that's why I think it's so important that you do what you do, because I think you are precisely the therapist that people actually need, because you are not necessarily always understanding. You actually help others to understand themselves in order to develop their own tools to transform. So let's go a little bit about transformation. When do you feel and see that someone is, or is making progress, and is potentially transforming from one being or struggle to another, and positively can advance his life?
Hmm. Well, I know this might sound overly simplistic, but once they start being honest with themselves, and that honesty means that a lot of people come and they say, I want to make changes. Great. Who doesn't? Right? But then you don't see progress. And the question I'll ask after a couple of weeks of not seeing progress, like, do you honestly want to make change? Like, or are you just saying this because that's the answer you think you should be saying? And sometimes people are look like they've been caught with, like a deer in headlights, but that's ultimately it. Is you have to be honest with yourself, right? If there's things in my life too right now where I'm like, you know what, I'm not ready to deal with this right now, but that honesty helps. It's like, okay, I'll deal with it in the future. Right now it's just not the time for it. But that's where that honesty comes in. And then if you're actually willing to deal with it, that also requires honesty. That also means that, okay, this thing that I'm doing, whether it involves other people, my partner, my family members, even myself, I need to be honest in the sense that I cannot do this anymore because it's not serving me.
Why do you think some people, they say they want to change, but they don't want to change? Why is that?
It's it's the discomfort of the unknown, right? And as crazy as it sounds, and most people they, even if they know, for example, they're in a relationship that is not fulfilling or unhealthy, they won't make a change because they're scared of what the uncertainty is. What's on the other side? As much as I know this is not healthy, it feels familiar. I know I get to come home to this home. I get to do this, all the things I get to do. Why would I disrupt it? Maybe I can just suck it up and deal with it. And a lot of people convince themselves of that. But that's where it's the cognitive dissonance, right? It's a lot of friction. And the only person that's suffering is the individual themselves. But that's where honesty is needed, right? So again, like I said, if people aren't willing to make those hard choices or make that progress, I will ask them, well, are you willing to accept that you can stay in this situation? If you're going to complain and it's bad, then do something about it. And if you can't, then just accept it. There's no in between. The in between is where people struggle even more.
So true. And to me, really, it seems like that some people really, they have an emotional home where they just feel, as you say, at home, right? They really like complaining, right? And sometimes it's just really nice, and you just get the same over and over. But it's like me watching The Office. It was the first series that I watched, and I'm not someone who usually watches at all, but it was like during COVID, and I really watched it, I think twice. So it was really fun. Furkhan, such a pleasure. I know we are a little bit, we gotta cut it short, but last question: what makes you truly feel alive?
Well, conversations like this, for sure, but the ability to wake up and not only learn and improve myself, but also have the opportunity and the gift of working with others and helping them.
Furkhan Dandia, thank you so much for being on the show and being truly a blessing to myself and really to the world. So everyone who wants to get in touch with Furkhan Dandia, we will put down the link of your homepage so you can really reach out to him, book a session, and you will, I'm sure, transform your life. Furkhan Dandia.
Thank you, Yannick.
That's why knowledge matters. Make your life a masterpiece. Visit now programs.d-ykm.com.